There is a plot by the globalists to depopulate the planet and to kill off as many people as they can manage. However, this plot is more insidious than you could ever imagine. That's what we're going to talk about in this video.
NordVPN, cybersecurity built for every day.
Hey, Jacqui, thank you so much for making yourself available.
Well, thank you for having me.
Hey, not at all. You are a good friend of Mark Atwood, who I've done a couple of videos with, and he completely boggles my mind. And he said, look, get Jacqui on to talk about how the globalists are out to kill us. Now, we're talking about our erstwhile and honorary leaders, those that we elect into positions of power and that are there to serve us. What are you talking about that they're out to kill us? Some kind of conspiracy nut?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually a conspiracy analyst, so if I hear of any kind of conspiracies, my interest is piqued, and I like to pop into the rabbit holes, have a quick rummage around, see what's going on there, and come to some conclusions. This particular rabbit hole is incredibly deep and dark, and it caught my attention probably back in 2019. I've always been aware of the whole depopulation agenda and what's going on in the background, but this particular arm of it, this particular tentacle of the depopulation octopus really caught my attention because it's so brutal and so blatant. So I suppose it started in 2019 big time when my dad went into a care home. He'd had a stroke, 2 strokes in fact, so they thought it would be good for him to have just a couple of months in a care home. This is what I thought, just to recover, because he needed 24-hour attention at that point. And I remember going with him to the first care home he was in. He was in one for a few weeks and it was awful, so I got him into another one. But the first care home, I said, hopefully he'll be recovered in a couple of months. I said this to the care home manager, and she kind of looked at me and shook her head and said, oh, no, he's probably not going to be leaving the care home. And my dad obviously overheard this, and he laughed and said, yeah, you walk in the front door and go out the back door in a box. And that is pretty true. My dad hit the nail on the head there, and she just kind of laughed. And she went, well, it is a bit like that, to be honest. And I said, well, no, he's only 76, and he's not terminally ill or anything. He's just recovering from a stroke. So I will be in to get him at some point in the near future once he's a bit better, get him back home again. He lived in a council house, so literally as soon as they heard he was in a care home, they were like vultures banging on the door saying, we want the house back. And I said, well, he's only gone away for a couple of months, he'll need the house when he comes home. They weren't having that at all. And this is something that happens quite a lot as well when it comes to the elderly going into care. So while he was in there, I used to go and visit him a lot, and then obviously we had the lockdowns happening. Just shortly before the first lockdown, I was talking on the phone to one of the care home staff about she was updating his notes basically, and she mentioned the letters DNR, do not resuscitate orders, and kind of skimmed over it very quickly. She said, well, he's got a DNR, that's good. And then she went, I said, wait, tell me about the DNR. As far as I knew at that point, they were just they were orders that were put on people in hospices, if they're terminally ill, saying, if this person stops breathing or if their heart stops for whatever reason, don't bother resuscitating them because they're inches away from death anyway. So I said, well, why has my dad got one of those? And she said, oh, everyone has them now since COVID. And so this was May 2020. And I said, well, that's a bit strange, but he doesn't need one, and I don't want him to have one, and he won't want one. So can you remove that? And she said, no, we're not allowed to remove them. I said, but don't we have to give our consent for them? And she said, not anymore. So I thought, well, that's very odd. I don't like the sound of that. And I've been a freelance journalist for over 40 years, so I thought I need to get that story into a mainstream paper, that they're putting these blanket DNRs on care home residents. That's a bit strange. So I investigated that, spoke to a couple of whistleblower doctors and various people in the know at the time, and found out that these DNRs would be being put on people in care homes, and also people being admitted into hospital with, COVID or whatever, or people who had symptoms of the so-called killer virus. So this included people over 50 apparently were being counted as elderly, people who had physical and mental disabilities, people with mental health issues, autistic people, and the elderly. They were all being given a DNR as soon as they were admitted into a care home, hospice, or a hospital. Like I said,
No, Jacqui, hold on a second. Whereabouts was your father with this care home?
my dad lived in Dagenham in Essex.
And the care home was in Dagenham, Essex.
No, it was a little bit further out. I think it was in Uxbridge, somewhere like that.
Okay, so Uxbridge is northwest of London.
No,
Or
sorry.
Upminster.
That's the one. I was getting mixed up.
Upminster is east of London.
That's the one.
London, on the outer edges of East
I
London.
kind of blocked out even the name. I think I could probably remember the name of the care home if I really thought about it. I kind of blocked a lot about
That's
that.
okay. But this is just local to. Was this just in this care home, or is this something that's in that part of England, or is it also international? Is it just an English problem? Is it also happening in the United States and in France and Germany and Australia?
Yeah, I found out later it was. At the time, I didn't know. I thought that's strange, and I was focused on my dad and not wanting him to have one, And I said, well, I need to have a conversation with a GP. When does the GP come in? By then, we were doing window visits,
Okay, now hold on a second. Yeah. We are going to come to that, right? But you're saying that this was in. So you are saying that this process of DNR or equivalent was also taking place in the United States.
Yeah, under Fauci. So Fauci was overseeing all the, let's say, the involuntary euthanasia going on over there. He was recommending slightly different drug protocol to the one we had here, but with the same results. I mean, whereas the protocol here was called NG163. That was introduced on the 3rd of April 2020 by Matt Hancock, who was the then health secretary, as we all know. He introduced this, it's called a NICE guideline. That's what the NG stands for, 163. And when this protocol was written up, he got it reviewed by some professors, a panel of professors and doctors, who all said that this isn't a good protocol. It will kill people. It's reminiscent of the Liverpool Care Pathway, which was a protocol that was banned in 2014 for being barbaric and inhumane. It involved the withdrawal of food, the withdrawal of hydration and fluids, the withdrawal of essential medications, and the administration of an opioid and a benzodiazepine, two categories of drugs that should never be used together because they result in the depression of the respiratory system. So why this would be a protocol for an illness that was allegedly a respiratory illness, I don't know, because this protocol would make it worse. And this is what these professors and doctors said. And they wrote this. The leader of this group was the world's best palliative care is the word, but care specialist, Dr. Sam Ahmedzi. And he actually wrote the article up for the British Medical Journal saying this protocol should not be used. But Matt Hancock listened to their advice, ignored it, and implemented the protocol anyway. So if anyone came into a care home or a hospital or a hospice with displaying any kind of respiratory symptoms, this protocol was brought out and used. And it invariably ended in their deaths. The problem was here, not that they were just killing people with respiratory issues, they were killing people who kind of scored highly on the frailty scale, which is a kind of scoring system when people are admitted to care homes and hospitals, especially when they're elderly, to see how frail they are. And if you score high on the frailty scale, you could just be put on this end-of-life protocol because of that score. You might be, you score highly if you're over 80, so say you're 85, but you're the healthiest 85-year-old ever, you would still get the 5 points or whatever it is they award to you because you're old. So it's a very ageist method of evaluating people, and so the elderly are at an extreme disadvantage when they go into hospitals back then in 2020 under this using this protocol. So this was what was happening back in 2020. It took me a while to find that out. I tried to get that story into the Telegraph because I'd done a few bits for them before, and the features editor there actually said, yeah, I'll commission that. That's really, really interesting. We need to get that out there. couple of months later, they still hadn't published it. And so I contacted him and said, are you going to use that article? And he said, no, we're not going to run it now. But he didn't say why. They don't often explain why they're not going to use something. They just say, oh, no, we're not using it now. I got it published immediately by an alternative news site. And that was in August 2020 that was published. Prior to that, the very first article was in March 2020 when I discovered that the coronavirus, as it was called then, obviously wasn't scary enough, that name, was kind of downgraded to not a high consequence infectious disease. That was in March, around March the 20th.
I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember pointing that out to friends and family. Say, look, they've downgraded it. And so why did they downgrade it? And then why was it ignored?
I think the reason they downgraded it was because, this is a guess here, that if it's not a highly infectious disease, I think you don't have to do a post-mortem, because they didn't want post-mortems to be done at this point, remember? So it's something to do with that. I can't remember exactly now. But when I read that, I just thought, well, I know there's no killer virus going around because I'd watched Event 201. Anyone who'd watched Event 201 who had paid attention to similar scenarios in the past would know exactly what was happening. It wasn't anything to do with a virus. And also coronavirus is just a blanket term for colds and flus, which, again, aren't what we're told they are, but that's another story. But it's nothing to be scared of. But I just thought all the people who are actually locking themselves in their homes and petrified, thinking if they stepped outside the door, they would be struck down, like the videos they'd seen on the TV of people in China, which was, I thought, absolutely hilarious. But it wasn't hilarious that people were taking this seriously. So I thought, if I can get that article in some mainstream papers, I naively thought, it might reassure a lot of people and make them feel less scared, especially elderly people who are watching the BBC and believing every word that they were being told, and having all this scaremongering pelted at them on an hourly basis. It seemed. I mean, I don't have a TV, but I did go and stay at my dad's house a lot when he was in the care home, just so I was nearby to the care home, and I put on his huge TV, and sometimes I'd be watching it, and it was so effective, the brainwashing. I even found myself thinking sometimes, oh, maybe I've got it wrong, maybe there really is something going on, and then I would give myself a slap and come to my senses and turn the TV off and think, calm down, woman. But I thought, imagine if you're sitting there watching that day in, day out, you definitely would be sucked in by it.
Especially if there's no counterfoil, no counter argument being presented, and you think that's it. For those poor souls who get their news from the Guardian or the BBC, oh dear.
Yeah, well, I thought if I could get this story into the Guardian or onto the BBC website, they would reassure them. But then, of course, I realised quite quickly that the media didn't want to reassure the public. They were doing quite the opposite. They wanted to put the fear of God into them and terrify them. As Matt Hancock was later discovered saying, scare the pants off people. That's what his job was. That's what he aimed to do. Nobody wanted that story. So I got that published very quickly. That was published on March the 24th on a news site called The People's Voice. I know the editor there, and he publishes quite a few of my articles, ones that the mainstream won't publish. So, so they were the first two early articles. So there was my dad in the care home, window visits. I did manage to get an appointment with the GP to talk to him about the DNR. This is me talking through a window with my dad sitting closest to the window and the GP standing behind my dad, shouting through a window, which they'd closed tight at this point, which is ridiculous. Because when I used to go, I'd get dad to open the window so we could have a little chat through the window. And I remember one day a carer barged in and she said, oh no, you can't have the window open. And I said, well, how can I talk to him if the window's closed? And she said, well, you talk to him on the mobile phone. And I said, well, my dad doesn't like using a phone, and also I think he's lost it. I think he lost 3 the time he was in there. They steal them basically. And I said, and also I'm not talking to my dad through a window on a phone. It's like a prison visit. He's not in prison, I'm not going to treat him like he is in prison. And so I'm not closing the window. I said, well, what are you afraid of? The COVID's coming in from the outside and attacking my dad, or the COVID's coming out of the care home window and attacking me? I said, it's all ridiculous. Anyway, she came over and slammed the window shut. It's just infuriating. And we saw at the time quite a lot of news stories and videos of similar things happening. And so I did start to write some articles about the situation in care homes. And when I finally got my dad out of the care home after 10 months of him being imprisoned, incarcerated, um, I started writing about that as well. The Telegraph were quite interested in that. So I did a few articles talking about getting him out of the care home, and then about trying to look after him at home on my own, which was a bit difficult, and just a couple of other general pieces about what was happening in care homes. And I did a few pieces for the Daily Mail as well, which they were on Mail online on the website there. But they kind of liked the odd story, but they didn't like anything that was like really counter narrative at the time or anti-government. Or obviously then when we got to January 2021, where I had all the people contacting me about the injections causing
the novel medical intervention, the really safe and effective one.
An effective one, yeah, causing problems. So obviously then I immediately thought, well, these need to be published. So was sending all these to again to all the mainstream papers who I used to work for on a regular basis, and they really didn't want to know. One paper, I think it was the Sunday Mirror, they were quite interested at one point, but she said, what we need some proper evidence to run these stories. We need actual proof that these safe and effective injections harm the people. We need like quotes from their GP, like verifying that. We need to see if they died. We need to see a death certificate saying that that's what caused the death. And I said, January 21, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get it. One good thing, actually, when I was talking to that particular editor, she did say, oh, you've slightly worried me now talking about this. She said, I was just going to go with my husband this evening to go and get our first injections. She said, but I think I'm going to hold off for a bit now. So I don't know whether she actually went or not. I hope not.
Yes.
Still alive. But yeah, so yeah, I was having those kind of conversations and just thinking, I'm not getting any work anymore, because of I'm not willing to go along with what the other journalists are writing and getting paid for, because I know a lot of it is nonsense. And so I was becoming a bit of a thorn in their side. I think at one point, I think now, well, back then, I think they just thought, who is this? Well, they knew who I was, but they were thinking, why is she sending all these crazy ideas? Whether they genuinely thought the pictures I was sending them were crazy, or whether they actually were told to react like that, I don't know. I have a very, very strong feeling they were sticking to some kind of rules that.
Well, they were getting a lot of funding from the government.
Yeah.
Which I think was greater than their advertising funding. So then, of course, they were doing as they were being bid to do.
Absolutely. I mean, one editor did say to me when I was pitching, this was a news editor, when I was pitching the problems with the injection story to him, he said, we can't publish any anti-vax stories, he said, because it would jeopardize the vaccine rollout. So he actually said that loud and clear. And I had that said to me, something similar said to me before when I was writing some articles for the Daily Mail about the flu mist vaccine that children were having. And the editor at the time said, I don't know if we can run this because we're being paid quite a lot in advertising to promote this stuff, So that's the money is more important to them than the stories. And if they've got big advertisers such as the government or the NHS paying to promote their products, big pharmaceutical companies, they're gonna not run stories that are, if they were advertising, say, a child's car seat from some big company, and then I wrote a story about how these weren't safe, they wouldn't run that story. They would actually, prefer to keep the advertiser on board and just get rid of the journalist who's exposing the dangers of a product. So I realised that pretty early on. So that was so that kind of takes us up to early 21. I did get my dad out of the care home in September 2020, at the end of September,
Why was it so difficult to get him out of the care home?
They were all like prisoners. They were locked in. I said, I need to come and get my dad out. And they said, well, you can't. We're in lockdown. I said, I don't care. You cannot keep him prisoner because the doors were locked. My dad used to say to me, why can't you come in? What's going on? I said, I really don't know, Dad. It doesn't make any sense, but don't worry, I'll get you out. He was getting depressed. He was almost suicidal at one point. He said, I don't see the point in being alive anymore. What is the point? This is so miserable. Why can't you come in? Why can't I come out? Because I used to go and get him and we'd go to the pub, you know, and he'd have a couple of beers. And
whoa, hold on. Wait a minute. So he's locked in, he can't go out, he's not with his friends and his family, then you'd go, meet up with him, take him to the local pub.
No, this was before the lockdowns.
Oh, before, okay, so before that. So before that, your dad would get to go for a drink with probably his most favorite person in life. Or one of his most favorite. You know, if you've got brothers and sisters, right? Then it's like, who does he love more than his own children? You're a terrible, terrible woman.
I know. So, and you know, obviously he was missing that, and it was really sad to see him getting more and more depressed. And so I rang the care home manager, and I think I eventually spoke to the care home owner and just said, I'm coming to get him tomorrow at 3, wheel him out in his wheelchair, have him ready, and I'm going to take him home. And they were like, oh, no, you can't do it. I said, well, if you don't have him ready at 3 o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to take you to court and I'm going to get you sued for false imprisonment, which is against the law, and also violation of his and my human rights. So I drove there the next day, got there for 3, and lo and behold, there he was outside with them all smiling at me and waving and saying, oh, lovely to see you. I thought they'd be like fuming and angry, and they kind of, we kind of said that I was just taking him out for a while, you know, and he needed a few of his belongings. And we got in the car. My dad, who had sort of slight dementia, vascular dementia, which looking back, I think was caused by a lot of the medications they put him on. They said it was the result of the stroke, but I know when we kind of reduced some of the medications at home, he wasn't bad at all, you know.
Right.
We got in the car and he said, oh, where are we going? We're going to the seaside. And I said, well, not yet, we're going to go home first. And it was quite strange because after a couple of days back in his house, he started to get what I could only describe as survivor's guilt. He started saying, oh, do you think I should go back to the care home? I said, well, do you want to? And he said, well, not really. He said, but what about the others, you know? How are they going to get out? And I said, well, I don't know, Dad. I can't get them all out, you know. And he said, well, maybe I should just go back because they'll be missing me. I said, yeah, they will be, but you don't really want to go back, do you? And he was like, no, not really. So, but he said he was worried about a couple of the carers that he'd made friends with, you know. And one guy that my dad had made friends with, he was one of the carers, lovely bloke. He kept in touch and sent texts and stuff for a few months and sent him a happy Christmas and stuff. But yeah, after that, my dad was pretty depressed. He wasn't happy being at home. He decided he didn't like his house. He didn't like the neighbourhood. It had really affected him badly that time in the care home. He had some kind of PTSD or something. I don't know. He was very anxious. He never used to be so anxious.
Right. Now, I've worked in care homes, done a little bit of work in elderly care homes. I didn't particularly enjoy it. It's not my cup of tea at all, right? So I do get, you know, they're not great. And what you've said is a really sad story, but this is hardly large-scale euthanasia or depopulation. It's just you and your dad, and you're able to get him out. So thanks for sharing that with us, Jacqui. But how does this tie in with a depopulation agenda?
Okay, well, back in 2020, I was writing about this stuff, remember? It was going in all the big newspapers. A couple of people were asking me to go on their podcasts and their radio shows to talk about, you know, what was happening with my dad and in care homes and stuff. And then David Icke, I don't know if you're familiar with David, he got me on his podcast to talk about what was going on in the care homes. And at this point, after that, a lot of people saw that. And lots and lots of people started coming to me. One man in particular with the most horrible story about how his dad had been killed in an NHS facility. Now, this particular man, he actually came to see me. He had all the evidence that we needed to show that his father had been murdered in an NHS facility. And from that point on, he has been involved in an inquest. This has gone on for 6 years now, and there's still not been a conclusion. This is how long these things take. If you do need to take them to court, you know, it's very hard to get lawyers to represent you because you're up against the government and the NHS and then their protocols. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. Most people don't have the stamina. This guy has got the stamina. His poor mother, though, who's in her 80s, she's been really struggling with it all, as you can imagine. They drag it out for as long as possible. I've been to like hearings last March, last August, last December, this March, and they're still dragging it on. It's absolutely unbelievable how the coroners behave in these cases. But so for most people I spoke to, that's not an option. They get their loved one's medical notes. They see the evidence there of the drugs they've been given and how they've actually been involuntarily euthanized, shall we say, for want of a better phrase. And they end up going into hospital or to a care home for one reason or another. And in a lot of cases, the people I spoke to over the following, shall we say, 6 months or so, there were so many people. I set up a support group, a WhatsApp support group, so I had them all in one place. I thought, I need to get these stories into the mainstream media because this is huge. There are people being killed by the NHS, and how can this be ignored? So the first man that came to me about it, who had a huge, thick file of evidence, we set up some meetings with some news editors. We met up in May 2021 with the news editor of the Daily Mail, who came to meet us in West London, and we sat with him for several hours. At first he thought we were nutters, obviously, and within a few minutes he was looking through the evidence and he went, this story is massive. He said, this is the biggest story that I've seen in years. This is headline news. And he said, can I take a copy of, we did copies of all the evidence for him to take. So he took that away with him. He said, I'll be in touch. Then we set up another meeting with the medical editor of the Mail on Sunday. Same thing. He said, this is, front page news. This should be on the front of every paper in the land. And we said, we know. And he said, how many people have you got with stories? I said, well, I think I had 16 at the time that were ready to be interviewed and have their photos in the papers and tell their whole stories, and that had evidence, right? Because obviously they were saying, we do need some evidence. I said, well, I've got it. It's all ready to go. So the first guy just kind of ghosted me, pretty much. Had one more conversation with him out after that, then he was just not available, didn't return my calls, didn't return my emails. The other guy said, I'm going to speak to a few of those people. Now, I thought he'd be a good bet, this guy, because he'd already written a story the previous year. In July 2020, he had a story in the Mail asking the question, were sedatives being used in large amounts to kill people in care homes? So he'd already touched on that. So I thought he can do it. If I can't get the story in, I don't have to write it. It's just important that this story gets read about. And so I thought, he's the guy. So, and he wrote that story when he didn't have any evidence. He was just pontificating, and asking the question. But now I said, look, you can do a proper big double page spread. We've got all kinds of case studies. There's stories that are horrific. And he said, okay, I'll speak to a few of them. I think he spoke to 4 or 5 of them. And then he went quiet. And when I chased him up, he just said, oh, there's not enough evidence. And I said, well, that doesn't make sense, because you wrote a story last year when there was no evidence. So now we have got evidence, and there is evidence. We've got all the medical records. We've got all the evidence you want. We've got proof. And the people are willing to be named and pictured, which is something that they always want in these kinds of stories. And he just went, no, I just don't think there's enough evidence. And then he sidled off, and the next thing I heard, he didn't work at the paper anymore. And now I think he works for some big pharmaceutical company, actually, strangely.
Wow.
So anyway, we're banging our heads.
Sorry, Jacqui, just tell me, what's the deal with sedatives? Because they just calm you down and help you go to sleep. Why?
Yeah.
How would they kill you?
They were using overdose. So if you give someone, and also it affects different people in different ways. If you're a tiny, frail, elderly person and you get 2.5 milligrams of midazolam injected into your arm, it could kill you. And they're supposed to titrate. If you're naive to a drug, if you've never had a drug before, like when you go to the dentist and they give you a little tiny injection first and go, is that gone numb? And if it's not, they give you a bit more. That's called titration. So when people go into hospital, and if they've never had a benzodiazepine before, if they've never had an opioid before, they need to give them half a milligram to start with. They weren't doing that. This new protocol, NG163, was advising to start with 2.5 milligrams, no matter the size or the age of the person. Now, that's dangerous in itself. There was also a note attached to this NG163 protocol saying, basically, I'll paraphrase it, basically saying, you've probably heard, and this is addressed to the doctors and nurses, you probably know that using these two drugs together causes respiratory depression, but don't worry about that, just follow the protocol and do it anyway, basically. So a lot of medics were looking at this instruction thinking, well, that's not right, but they were being told to do it anyway, and they were just going along with what the bureaucrats wanted them to do. So
they were just following orders. That's okay. That's okay to follow orders, even bad ones that kill your patients when you're a doctor. There's nothing wrong with that, Jacqui. I think you're being a bit unreasonable.
Yeah. So, well, this is what they did actually do, and it transpires 6 years later that it seems that if I had taken my dad home and given him an overdose of midazolam and morphine in his house, I would have been arrested and charged with murder. But if he stayed in the care home and did that when a doctor or a nurse did that to him, that's fine. Wow. So even now it seems it's okay if a doctor does it, but it's not okay if you do it. And it shouldn't be okay for anyone to do it. I'm not saying that family should be able to do that.
And their family members, the loved ones, they wouldn't know that such a large doses of midazolam is dangerous, or that it hasn't been titrated, and how important titration is. And I do remember something about how before lockdown started, there was a massive importation of midazolam, and then also how certain other medications like ivermectin and melatonin were no longer available. Because I used to buy melatonin in the UK.
That's right. And
lockdown started, you couldn't get melatonin.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah, I think it's still quite hard to get, isn't it now?
Yeah, still can't get it. You got to get it on prescription or from abroad.
Yeah, I was in Italy, and there were vending machines with melatonin in, because one of the other journalists on this trip, because I do a bit of travel journalism sometimes, which means I get free trips to quite nice places, which is great. But at this particular time, we were going on some trek somewhere, and there was a vending machine, and one of the guys on the trip said, I just need to stop here because I need to get some melatonin. So it's available in vending machines there, So yeah, very bizarre. But a lot of the drugs, antibiotics, they weren't being given either, were they, for these chest infections? So people were getting quite ill.
No, they were being put on ventilators. And I remember learning a little bit about them and how they were harmful, because they were just, I think, like too much air pressure for someone who's got a respiratory illness and can't deal with that level of air pressure. And then also, don't do anything until you're really, really sick. What you mean? Don't deal with the condition when you're mildly ill?
Well, the main problem with the ventilators is that they were putting a lot of people on them who weren't ill. They might have gone in with a bit of a sniffle, or they might have gone in after a dizzy spell or something. So in my book, which we'll get onto later, there's the story of one lady who felt a bit dizzy one day, and her daughters said, just pop to A&E, get yourself checked out. She'd been line dancing the night before. She was cooking in the kitchen, felt a bit faint, and she said, it was nothing. And they said, well, just go to A&E and get yourself checked out. 29 hours later, she was dead. She was fit as a flea. She had nothing wrong with her, because they saw her age. I think she was 82. And they put her on an end-of-life protocol, and 29 hours later, which actually is the exact average time it takes from the syringe driver which is the pump put onto someone's arm or leg, and death is 29 hours. That's the average time. Wow. That's just one of the 42 stories in my book, which I'll tell you about in a bit.
Well, show us the book. Show us the book now. Let's have a look.
It's Murdered by the State.
Murdered by the State. Okay.
42 separate stories from people that I've spoken to in depth, the devastated relatives of victims, stories told in their own words about involuntary euthanasia, the silent genocide that was happening behind the locked doors of hospitals and care homes.
Of the National Death Service.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And people can get that because you're also on Substack and X, and people can get that through your Substack or through your X.
Yeah, I can give you the link as well if you want to put it up on the screen later. There's a hardback version and there's a paperback version. And there's also something really interesting. We've done an audio book. So I have this, Mark Atwood's publishing company has published this, 104 Publishing. And we had the idea of Mark had the idea of an audio book. And I said, how about if we get each person, see these people on the cover, they're the victims. So if you look close, you can see some of them are not old. Some of them are young. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had the people who told the stories in the books to actually narrate stories? Now, not everyone could do that for one reason or another, and the people who couldn't do it, I just got other people to do it on their behalf. But over half of the stories are actually narrated by the devastated relative of the victims. So, and it's unlike any audio book you've ever heard. It's very hard to listen to, actually. Even though I've listened to it many times, I still struggle getting one story without getting at least one tear in my eye. You know, it's a really hard listen, and the book is actually a really hard read. And a lot of people don't want to read it. I mean, I know a lot of people have bought it but can't bring themselves to read it, or they read one story and can't go on. Even my neighbour here, she bought it, and I thanked her for buying it, and I said, "What do you think of it?" And she said, "Oh, I'm not going to read it. It looks too depressing." And so a lot of people have this attitude: either they don't believe it, they don't want to believe it, they don't want to upset themselves by reading it, so they just don't. They just turn a blind eye and stick their head in the sand. But I really feel that people should read this and wake up to what's going on, if only to arm themselves, you know.
Yeah, well, I think it's important for people to wake up. All the myriad ways that we are being assaulted and genocided. You know, if we can, let's just create a list, you and I, between them now, right? So there's the open borders, which increases crime and creates friction between communities. There's the and also raises food prices because you have more people competing for the same amount of stock.
Yeah.
Then there's the increase, the net zero. So we're not allowed to use the abundant amounts of gas and coal and oil that Britain has. We have to rely on wind and sun in December at night time. Then what else is there? There's a very safe and effective injections, and I hope you and I, we're both onto our 27th boosters by now.
In every orifice.
There's that, of course, right? Then there's the way that the population, the birth control is being limited because of the very safe and effective injections. The birth rate has gone down.
Affected, yeah.
Yeah, the trans agenda, which makes people sterile.
Yeah.
What else is there?
We've also got, you know, the gay agenda being pushed as well, because less gay couples have kids, you know, so that's a good way of reducing population if you're pushing that as well.
What do you mean? You've seen a man together can't beget children?
Well, I wrote some very interesting stories prior to 2020. Back in 2017, 2018, I met several trans couples. That I did several stories with this one couple. And they met when he was a man, but a transvestite, so he used to like to wear fancy ladies' clothes. And she was a lesbian, and they became friends. But as their relationship developed, he decided that he was actually trans and wanted to have a sex change. By then, she had decided that she wasn't a lesbian anymore, because obviously they'd had a child at this point as well. So she decided she wasn't gay anymore. But then she decided that she too was trans, so they both started going through the whole process of changing sex, and it ended up with one who was previously male and fathered the child. He ended up female. He actually went to have all the surgery and everything and all the hormones, and he's now female. And the woman who gave birth to the child is now male. So the child was brought up with the person who gave birth to him, his dad, and the person who didn't give birth to him but that originally provided the sperm was mum. So I managed to get them on daytime TV a couple of times as well, and it was quite interesting, the change, because when they first went on, it must have been about 2017, I would say. The hate they got was unbelievable, right? And I felt really sorry for them at the time, because they were quite nervous about speaking out about it, because it was quite unusual about them. A lot of people were saying, my God, that child's going to grow up to be a psychopath and all this. And a year later, they went on again, and the whole tone had changed. Maybe it was 2018 or 19 by then, and everyone was much more open to it and was saying what a fantastic couple they were, and I'm sure the child was lovely. And as it happens, the child has grown up. The child must be 11 or 12 now. He seems to be a nice child. I don't know. I haven't met the child personally, but he seems to be doing fine. and they've been good parents. So, but yes, so that's something that was suddenly okay. You know, when it had been vilified in the past, it was suddenly becoming more acceptable and more okay. And obviously, you know, as you say, if people do have these treatments, they're not going to be able to reproduce. So that's all part of it as well, and the gay agenda, and also the infertility. And then obviously my interest was mainly in what they were doing at the other end of people's lives when they were being involuntarily euthanized.
And of course, just reminded me the beginning of life, where this government has now decriminalized abortion till full term, which
Yeah,
isn't abortion, it's infanticide.
yes,
Evil.
absolutely, yeah. And they're trying to push the assisted dying bill, obviously, as well at the other end.
Yeah, I think that failed. The Lords talked it out. Thank goodness that one.
No, it'll be pushed through at some point. There's 10 countries in the world now where it's legal. You can see what they're doing in Canada with the whole MAID thing, the medical assistance in dying, where children are being euthanized, where people who don't want to be euthanized are being euthanized. Sorry, isn't that killing someone? Isn't that murder? Well, it's murder anyway, but there was the recent story of an elderly couple. The man was looking after his wife, said he was getting a bit tired because he was suffering from burnout, and he talked her into maybe going to see about being euthanized because she was getting on a bit, and she kind of agreed to it, went along with it. They had a date set for her to actually die. As it was approaching, she said she'd actually changed her mind and didn't want to do it anymore, and they basically said to her it was too late, and they did it anyway. So that's murder. I mean, and they're allowing children over 12 who they deem to be responsible and mature enough to make those decisions, which is horrendous. You know, think of all the teenagers, and you know, remember being a teenager yourself and
Being miserable.
I hate myself, I want to die. You know,
Yeah.
one goes through that. You know, but they're going, oh, okay then. If that's how you feel, hop in the pod. Or but the other thing is, you know, people think that these euthanasia type deaths are. They just give you a little injection and you fall asleep and it's all very lovely. It's a horrendous way to die. It's absolutely a
How
horrendous
do they
way.
do it? What
They
happens?
use midazolam and morphine and other drugs. So this is my point as well. All these people who've been killed under this COVID protocol, NG163, go through the same thing as a prisoner on death row being executed. It's a lethal injection.
Okay, but what happens to the person who's receiving it?
Okay, well, people who've gone through it and managed to escape and come out the other side, they're few and far between, but I have spoken to a couple. It feels like you're drowning because what's happening is your lungs are slowly filling up with liquid, right? Because the less breaths you take, the more liquid is being kept in the lungs. You're not breathing out the droplets, they're staying in your lungs, so the lungs are filling up. But at the same time, there's been reports of feeling like your brain is on fire. I mean, I can't even imagine what that feeling is. But you're drowning and you can't breathe, and your breathing goes down from, say, 60 breaths a minute to 30, then to 10, then to 3. And it was only when I was first started hearing about all this stuff back in 2021 that I realised that my own mum had been euthanized in a hospice in this fashion when she was 68 years old. So, but I had not thought about it until people started telling me the stories, and I was thinking, this is sounding a bit familiar. So, yeah, I sat and watched my mum be euthanized in 2009, and it took 45 hours from the point when they put the syringe driver on her arm. I had no clue what was going on back then. I'm a very nosy, curious person, so when they were putting the syringe driver on her arm, I said, oh, what's that? And they said, oh, it's just a pump to, you know. I said, well, what kind of drugs? Why are you giving her drugs? She had breast cancer. She wasn't anywhere near death at that point. They said, oh, it's just to make her comfortable. Of course, anyone who knows now, we know that's a euphemism for, you know, we're putting them on the end of life pathway, which back then would have been the Liverpool Care pathway, which involves, as I mentioned earlier, you know, so there's no food from that point, no water, no. If you took drugs for diabetes or anything like that, they would all be removed. And then they would be administering very slowly these constant pumping of benzodiazepines and opioids, which together, if you look in the British National Formulary, together it says they must never be used concomitantly, those two drugs, because they will stop breathing. So, of course, in an execution, I just watched the whole Netflix series about Jeffrey Dahmer, and they mentioned John Wayne Gacy in it, who was executed in 1994. And I just thought, oh, I don't know much about him. So I kind of looked it up, and it was really bizarre because I looked him up on Wikipedia just to see what he did and what all happened. He'd murdered 33 people. Strange number, 33. They like that one. And his execution went a bit wrong because there was a blockage in one of the IV tubes. So it took 18 minutes, which they said was an unnaturally long time for someone to take to die. They can't. It's wrong if they. Well, it's all wrong anyway. I mean, I don't agree with the death penalty at all. But it's called prolonged torture if it goes on for too long, and so they have to do it as quickly as possible. So they give them massive doses, especially if it's a big guy like John Wayne Gacy was. But what was weird when I read on Wikipedia about him was that he said, "I'm being murdered by the state."
Mm.
And that really leapt out of the page at me. I was thinking, well, that's weird, because of the random way I started reading about him, and it was only last night. I didn't know that before I chose the title for this book. And titles for books and stories just come to me. I don't have to think hard about them. They're just there, Likewise with the first film I made, just going back to 2021, because I'd had that. I've been friends with David Icke for some time. I worked with him 13 years ago when he set up TPV in London. But his son Jamie runs Iconic, which is the media company. And he came to me and he knew that I was trying to get these stories published. He said, "Why don't we make a documentary about it?" So I said, "Yeah, let's do it." So in 2021, A Good Death was made. It's called A Good Death because the word euthanasia comes from the Greek word euthanatos, which means a good or happy death. That's where the word euthanasia comes from. And in one of the opening scenes in the film, we've got Matt Hancock talking to the MP, Dr. Luke Evans, about what you mentioned earlier, bringing in more supplies of midazolam and morphine. Midazolam they had to get from France because we'd run out over here. They ordered a couple of years' supply, and it was all gone within a few months.
Wow.
So the question was, what are they using this midazolam for? They initially kind of made the excuse, oh, we're giving it to people when we put them on ventilators, because it's a really horrible process to be put on a ventilator. But all the ventilators, they stopped using them in January 2021 because they realized they were killing people. And people were realizing, so they withdrew the use of ventilators very early on, but the use of midazolam continued. So it's like the other use of midazolam, it can be very effective for minor surgeries. But no minor surgeries were being done. No one was getting operations back then. Yet this midazolam was being used up at an alarming rate. So the question had to be asked, what is it being used on? And if there's any left over, where is it? But there wasn't any left over. It was in the bodies of the people that they'd killed with it. Midazolam is sometimes used for serious, very severe epilepsy as well. So it does have its uses, but it has to be, given in small amounts, monitored very carefully. You don't just whack it into someone's arm with a whole load of morphine as well.
Yeah.
Knowing what it's going to do.
Into anyone and everyone. And this process was being replicated in the United States, in France. I imagine in all the countries that were captured by maybe some of them still are captured by the World Economic Forum.
Yeah. And in America, they weren't using midazolam so much. They were using a drug called remdesivir, which a lot of nurses called remdesivir because they knew how lethal this drug was. This drug had been used in trials and it had killed. So, but Fauci was recommending it to the hospitals in America, saying, use this if anyone comes in with COVID. So, of course, people were dying from overdoses of remdesivir used with fentanyl and stuff like that. So, again, all in the name of helping people through COVID, but it wasn't helping anyone.
Jacqui, you've just twigged a thought, right? There is a country that used drugs as a weapon against another nation and did it in such a way that they extracted a hell of a lot of silver for that. The British grew opium in India, shipped it to China, sold it to the Chinese who became addicts in return for silver. And then the British they then use that strategy in other parts of the world using drugs and alcohol in order to attack local populations,
Yeah.
including bringing in fentanyl through Canada and Mexico into the United States to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans. So
Yeah.
now what we're talking about is the British state and other states using midazolam or remdesivir or these similar protocols to kill their own within their own borders.
Yeah.
Now, why are they doing that?
Because they want to reduce the numbers.
Why?
The reason they want to reduce the numbers is a smaller population is easier to control. So the less people there are, the better.
How lovely.
That's one theory. There are many other theories, but that's the one I kind of...
Well, that kind of makes sense. It ties in with Agenda 2030 and the Great Reset. They want to reduce the population because it is easier to control a smaller population, and then they can replace us with AI and robots. Plus, also a significantly smaller population means more of the land is available for them to enjoy.
Exactly, and also there's money. Obviously, it always boils down to the money. Elderly people, for example, cost them a lot of money. You know, with their hospital visits, their pensions. The longer they live. If my dad hadn't been killed when he was, that's another story, because he only lasted another year after he came out of the care home. But he would have lasted longer if he hadn't been visited that day by a bunch of murderous paramedics. But I can tell you about that later if you're interested. But I have written that story up, and it's available to read on David Icke's website, actually. But so I've distracted myself there. What are we talking about?
We're talking about how much it costs to keep.
So if my dad had stayed alive for another 20 years, so he was 78 when he died, I worked out roughly in pensions it would have cost them another £500,000 to keep him going for 20 years, and that's not counting hospital visits, and which is an average of £5,000 per person per visit. But if they're in for a few days, you know, so the elderly and the disabled and the ill and people who need medical attention, they're costing them too much money. So they want to get rid of those as quickly as possible. The useless eaters, as they've been called in the past. And yeah, so anything that is costing them too much money, they need to hone down a bit. So I think that's one of the reasons.
Well, I think ultimately that is it. There isn't the money because of the way that the fiat currency system works. It's just creating more debt, more debt, more debt, more debt, and then the debt becomes unpayable. And then the risk is when the currency collapses, because the only solution is to print more fiat, more fiat, more fiat. That loses all value. You then have a revolution, which changes the government. So then what they have to do is to kill us off, and that disarms us because we're easier to control. And they're going to do it quick enough and then get the digital IDs and the biometric wallets and the CBDs in place real quick before we wake up. But the problem is, Jacqui, thanks to people like you and people like Mark Atwood, who's been on my channel a couple of times, and David Icke, God bless him, and the great work he does, they're going to be, people are waking up. And their whole project is way behind. It's falling apart. It's like they're putting sticking plaster and trying to, let's push it through anyway, even though it's falling apart, and it will fail. The tragedy is, I think they're going to do a lot of damage before it completely falls apart, even more damage than they've done, right? But thank you so much for what you've done and what you continue to do in speaking out for the sake of these people, for all of us.
Yeah, I feel I'm doing the right thing, but I think the government might view people like us as the pesky kids in Scooby-Doo, you know.
No, we're not the pesky kids, we're the useless eaters.
I don't with that as well. But yeah, I think they don't like the meddling that we're doing. Obviously, it's causing problems. But yeah, I was just going to say something about. Now it's completely slipped my mind now. But I was going to say, do you remember the film Logan's Run back in 1976?
I never saw it, but tell
It
us.
was a science fiction film starring the lovely Jenny Agutter, who all the boys were crazy about at the time, and Michael Douglas. I think it was Michael Douglas. And they're in a dystopian future society where they all have to be euthanized at 30, right? So obviously no babies were being made, and any babies that were made were taken away. They weren't brought up by the parents, they were brought up by the state. But But the idea was they had this kind of watch timer thing, which was from the moment they're born, it was countdown to when they're 30, right? So you could see how much time. And the Jenny Agutter character and Michael York it was, sorry, and Michael York character, they were approaching 30 and they decide they don't want to die because it's not seen by society as a terrible thing. It's seen as something to celebrate and rejoice in. It's like a big party, when you're 30 and you go on this thing called a carousel and you're fired up into the air and all these fireworks and everything. And it's a beautiful thing apparently, and they all really, really look forward to it. But this particular couple actually decide, no, we don't want to go on the carousel, and they do a runner. He's called Logan, so it's called Logan's Run, and then the officials are after them. So that's basically the premise of the film. But I think, again, with predictive programming and everything, I think that that will happen. Not 30 perhaps, but I'm thinking maybe 70 or 80. And people are being programmed now, especially young people, to actually accept that old people shouldn't really be around anymore. Even old people themselves. There's adverts on TV in Canada promoting euthanasia, promoting MAID, basically showing all these lovely old people sitting on beaches going, well, I've had my life, let's make way for the young people now, and all this sort of stuff. And it's just painful to watch. These people are being brainwashed. So if the elderly people themselves are feeling that it's okay. I mean, when I first mentioned this particular story to an editor at a UK broadsheet and told her what was going on in hospitals and care homes, she said, well, it's not much of a story really, is it? And I said, it's a massive story. And she said, well, no, because we know that people are given a helping hand at the end. If they're ill, if they're terminally ill, or if they're very, very old, we know that when they go into hospital, they're probably not going to come out because they're given up the drugs and the next thing. We know that's going on. So where's the story? I said, well, the story is that people are being killed in care homes and hospitals. I said, and they're not just people who are decrepit and ancient and terminally ill. There's young people that it's happening to. There's people who don't have terminal illnesses. People are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And also, these deaths are being used, which I forgot to mention earlier, to bump up the numbers of COVID, because they needed to frighten people and say, look, all these people are dying. Look what's happening in the care homes. There was a massive spike of deaths, excess deaths in April 2020. That's when all the midazolam arrived from France, And I write a lot for the Light newspaper, and I did a big headline story about a year ago about a study that was done that actually categorically proved that those deaths tied in with the arrival of the extra midazolam in care homes, and that the people were being involuntarily euthanized, being drugged to death, and it's pretty obvious what's been going on. And then, of course, their deaths were being listed as COVID.
That's right. It's all a COVID death. In fact, people should let us know. Let us know in the comments if COVID killed you. Just if you're now dead because of COVID, you can add to the statistics. Or actually, better not. Maybe just let us know if you're a meddler. If you're one of these meddlesome meddlers, these pesky kids, that would be a much better comment. Jacqui, I just really, really want to thank you for coming on and letting us know about this. We've got to keep spreading the word. So thank you to you, Jacqui. Thank you to everybody for commenting. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you to everybody who's watching. Thank you to Mark Atwood, who's going to be on soon, for introducing me to Jacqui. And thank you also, David Icke, for all that you do. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for supporting me via Ko-fi.com. Thank you for signing up for my free newsletter. And between now and when I see you next, this is Rich and Jacqui signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Today, NordVPN, cybersecurity built for every day.